December 1944. Stalag VII-A, Moosburg, Bavaria. The cold arrived before dawn, seeping through wooden walls that had long ago given up the fight against winter. Frost painted intricate patterns on the inside of barracks windows, each crystalline formation a small reminder that the war had not yet killed beauty, only hidden it. The men inside pulled threadbare blankets tighter, their breath forming clouds that lingered in the darkness like prayers that had nowhere to go. Stalag VII-A held nearly 80,000 prisoners by December 1944. American, British, French, Soviet, Italian. Men who had fought on opposite sides of battles now pressed together in overcrowded barracks where nationality meant less than the warmth of the body beside you. The camp had been designed for 10,000. That number had been surpassed 3 years earlier. Technical Sergeant Michael Brennan had been there since October, captured during a supply run near Aachen when his convoy stumbled into a German patrol that seemed to materialize from the fog itself. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. Brennan remembered the odd silence afterward, punctuated only by the sound of boots on wet leaves and the metallic click of rifle bolts. His war had ended not with thunder but with a whisper. The guards at Stalag VII-A existed in their own kind of captivity. They were men deemed unfit for frontline duty. Too old, too injured, too worn down by years of war that Germany was losing with mathematical certainty. They wore uniforms that hung loose on frames that had once been fuller, and they carried rifles with the mechanical indifference of men performing a task they no longer believed in but couldn't stop doing. Brennan had learned their routines quickly. Roll call at dawn, the count that always took too long because someone was always too sick to stand. The distribution of soup that was more water than sustenance, served in portions that grew smaller as winter deepened. The long hours of nothing, punctuated by rumors that swept through the camp like wind through empty fields. The Americans are coming. The Russians are closer. The war will end by Christmas. Christmas came and went. The war continued. It was January 15, 1945, when Brennan first noticed the guard. Not because the man did anything unusual, but because he did nothing unusual so consistently. Every morning at the same time, he would walk the perimeter of the American compound, his breath visible in the frozen air, his boots crunching on snow that had been trampled into ice. Other guards talked to each other, shared cigarettes, complained about the cold. This one walked alone. The prisoners had given him a name. Not out of affection but out of the human need to label everything, even their captors. They called him der Geist. The ghost. He never spoke unless required, never made eye contact, never showed anger or compassion or anything at all. He simply existed, a gray figure in a gray uniform moving through gray days. Brennan watched him out of habit more than curiosity. In a POW camp, you watched everything. You learned which guards could be bribed with cigarettes from Red Cross parcels. Which ones would beat you for looking at them wrong. Which ones were indifferent enough to ignore small violations of rules that had been written by men who had never been cold or hungry or hopeless. Der Geist fit none of those categories. He enforced rules when enforcement was required, but never with enthusiasm. He distributed rations with the precision of a clerk, measuring portions that were already insufficient with a scrupulousness that bordered on the absurd. He walked his patrols like a man trapped in a routine he couldn't escape, and perhaps that's exactly what he was. The cold deepened as January wore on. Men who had survived months of captivity began to falter. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Dysentery spread through barracks where sanitation had become a luxury the Germans could no longer provide. The camp's medical supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. When men died, which they did with increasing frequency, their bodies were carried to a shed near the camp's entrance to await burial in ground that had frozen solid weeks ago. Brennan developed a cough that he couldn't shake. It started as a tickle in his throat and evolved into something deeper, something that rattled in his chest when he breathed. He tried to hide it during morning roll call because men who showed weakness were sometimes separated from the general population, sent to barracks for the sick where the survival rate was considerably lower. He wasn't particularly afraid of dying. He had been afraid during his first weeks of captivity, when everything was new and terrible and unknown. But fear required energy, and energy was something the camp had extracted from him along with hope and comfort and the simple ability to feel warm. What remained was a kind of hollow endurance, the determination to survive not because survival meant anything particular, but because the alternative meant giving up, and giving up meant the cold had won. January 23 arrived with temperatures that dropped below zero. The guards issued no additional blankets because there were no additional blankets to issue. Men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat with strangers who had become brothers through the simple mathematics of survival. Some of them prayed. Some of them cursed. Most of them said nothing at all, conserving the calories that speech required. Brennan's cough worsened. By evening, he was having trouble catching his breath. His chest hurt with each inhalation, a sharp pain that radiated outward like cracks in ice. The men in his barracks looked at him with the careful neutrality that prisoners develop when they see someone beginning to fail. They couldn't help him, and acknowledging his deterioration would force them to confront the possibility that they might be next. That night, the cold reached its peak. Brennan lay on his wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling he could barely see in the darkness, listening to the symphony of suffering that surrounded him. Coughs, groans, whispered prayers in languages he didn't understand. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying quietly, the sound muffled as if the man was ashamed of his own despair. Brennan thought about home. Not the broad concept of home, but specific details. The way sunlight came through the kitchen window of his parents' house in Philadelphia on summer mornings. The smell of his mother's coffee, which she made too strong and drank too sweet. The sound of his father's laugh, which was rare enough to be memorable. These memories felt distant now, like stories someone had told him about a person he used to be. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to escape, if only for a moment, the reality of where he was. The cold pressed against him from all sides. His lungs struggled with each breath. And somewhere in the darkness, he heard footsteps. Guards walking their rounds, performing their duties even though the war was lost and everyone knew it. Tomorrow would be January 24th. He would survive the night because he had no choice but to survive. And in the morning, der Geist would walk his patrol, gray and silent and separate from everything, a ghost moving through a camp full of men who were learning what it meant to be forgotten by the world. Morning roll call on January 24th lasted longer than usual. The count never matched the records, which meant recounting, which meant standing in formation while guards moved along the lines with clipboards, their fingers clumsy with cold as they tried to make numbers align with reality. Men swayed on their feet. Some collapsed. Those who fell were dragged to the side by their companions, who knew that falling during roll call meant trouble none of them needed. Brennan stood in the third row, trying to suppress his cough and failing. Each attempt to stay quiet resulted in a more violent spasm when he finally let it out. The man beside him, a navigator from Ohio whose name Brennan could never remember, gave him a worried glance but said nothing. Speaking during roll call was forbidden, and the camp's rules were enforced not by the guards' enthusiasm but by the prisoners' collective understanding that breaking rules made life harder for everyone. Der Geist walked along the American section with his usual methodical pace. He counted silently, his lips moving slightly as he matched faces to numbers. He had done this hundreds of times. The routine had worn grooves in his behavior, pathways he followed without conscious thought. Check the rows. Verify the count. Move to the next section. Repeat until the morning's obligation was fulfilled. He passed Brennan without pausing. The cough that rattled in Brennan's chest remained locked behind clenched teeth. The guard's eyes swept across him like a searchlight that found nothing worth illuminating. For a moment, Brennan felt relief. He had become invisible again, just another prisoner in an ocean of prisoners, anonymous and therefore safe. But der Geist stopped. 3 steps past Brennan's position, he stopped and turned. His eyes, which Brennan had never really noticed before because he had never really looked at the man's face, settled on him with an attention that felt suddenly, terribly specific. They were gray eyes. Of course they were gray eyes. Everything in this place was gray. But they held something Brennan hadn't expected to see. Recognition. Not the recognition of a guard identifying a prisoner who had broken a rule. Not the recognition of an enemy seeing another enemy. Something else. Something that made Brennan's stomach tighten with a fear that was different from the general anxiety that had become his constant companion. It was the fear of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had the power to make his life significantly worse. The guard stepped closer. The clipboard in his hands remained motionless. Around them, other prisoners held their breath, not literally but emotionally, the way men do when they sense that something is happening that will affect them all even if it's happening to someone else. The rules of camp survival were clear. Stay anonymous. Don't stand out. Being noticed by guards was never good. Geist studied Brennan's face with an intensity that seemed out of place in a morning roll call that was supposed to be routine. The moment stretched. Time, which moved so slowly in the camp that days felt like weeks, suddenly contracted. Seconds became hours. Brennan waited for the accusation, the order to step forward, the beginning of whatever punishment his visibility had earned him. Instead, the guard smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It didn't transform his face or make him suddenly look kind or compassionate or any of the things that smiles were supposed to convey. It was small, almost invisible, the kind of expression that someone makes when they remember something pleasant but don't want to share it. A private moment made public for just an instant before being hidden away again. And then he moved on. He continued his count, checked his clipboard, and walked toward the next section of prisoners. The entire interaction had lasted perhaps 15 seconds. To anyone watching from a distance, nothing had happened. One guard had paused, looked at one prisoner, and continued his duties. The machinery of the camp's daily routine ground forward without interruption. But Brennan felt something shift. He couldn't have explained it if asked. The smile had been so brief, so subtle, that he almost questioned whether it had happened at all. Maybe he had imagined it, a hallucination born from fever and exhaustion and the desperate human need to find meaning in meaningless things. Maybe the guard's expression had been a grimace, not a smile, a brief muscle spasm that Brennan's mind had transformed into something it wasn't. Except he knew what he had seen. And more importantly, he knew what he had felt in that moment. The guard had looked at him not as a prisoner or an enemy or an inconvenience, but as a person. As someone who existed beyond the number assigned to him, beyond the uniform that identified his nationality, beyond the barbed wire that defined his current reality. Roll call ended. The prisoners dispersed to their morning routines. Brennan walked back to his barracks with the others, his cough returning now that he no longer needed to suppress it. The man from Ohio asked if he was all right, and Brennan said yes because what else could he say? No one mentioned the moment with the guard. It had been too small, too brief, too insignificant to warrant discussion. But throughout the day, Brennan found himself thinking about it. Not obsessively, but the way you think about a puzzle whose solution hovers just beyond reach. Why had the guard smiled? What had he seen in Brennan's face that prompted that response? Was it recognition of a shared humanity, or was it something more specific, some memory or association that Brennan couldn't possibly know about? The camp's routine continued. Soup at midday, watery and lukewarm. Hours of nothing. Men playing cards with decks so worn the suits were barely visible. Men writing letters they couldn't send. Men staring at walls or at their hands or at nothing at all, lost in thoughts they didn't share because sharing thoughts required trust, and trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Geist walked his afternoon patrol at the usual time. Brennan, sitting on the steps of his barracks, watched him from a distance. The guard moved with the same mechanical precision, the same absence of expression, the same ghost-like quality that had earned him his nickname. Nothing about his behavior suggested that the morning's moment had meant anything to him or that he even remembered it. But Brennan remembered. He turned the memory over in his mind like a coin whose value he couldn't determine. A smile in a place where smiles didn't exist. A moment of recognition in a system designed to reduce men to numbers. It was such a small thing, almost nothing at all. And yet, for reasons Brennan couldn't articulate, it felt important. That night, his cough worsened again. The pain in his chest intensified. He lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, and tried to understand why a guard's smile mattered to him. Men were dying here. His own health was deteriorating. The war continued to grind forward with its terrible momentum. In the face of all that suffering and uncertainty, what possible significance could a stranger's momentary expression hold? But significance, Brennan was learning, wasn't always measured by size or duration. Sometimes it was measured by timing. By context. By the simple fact that in a place designed to strip away humanity, even the smallest acknowledgement of it became profound. The guard had smiled at him, and in doing so, had reminded him that he was still a person worth smiling at. It wasn't hope. Brennan was too practical, too worn down by months of captivity, to mistake a smile for hope. But it was something. A small light in a place that had been dark for so long that he had almost forgotten what light looked like. And sometimes, that was enough. The following days brought no dramatic changes. Stalag VII-A continued its slow dissolution, held together by routine and inertia and the simple fact that neither the guards nor the prisoners knew what else to do. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it in the air, in the way orders from headquarters became less frequent and more confused, in the gradual breakdown of the camp's already minimal organization. But endings take time, and while they unfold, people still have to eat and sleep and survive. Brennan's cough persisted. He tried to hide it during roll calls, but the effort required to suppress it left him weak and dizzy. Other prisoners began to avoid him, not out of cruelty but out of the same instinct that makes people step away from illness they don't understand and can't cure. He didn't blame them. In the camp's economy of survival, sympathy was an expense few could afford. Geist continued his patrols. Brennan watched for him now, though he tried not to be obvious about it. The guards' routines were so predictable that Brennan could track his position in the camp at any given time without looking. Morning patrol at dawn. Midday rounds during soup distribution. Afternoon walk along the perimeter. Evening check before the barracks were locked for the night. The same pattern, day after day, like a clock that never wound down. On January 28, something changed. It was during the midday soup distribution. Prisoners lined up with their metal bowls, shuffling forward in a queue that moved with agonizing slowness. The soup was thinner than usual, which seemed impossible given how thin it had been the day before. The prisoners muttered complaints in low voices, knowing that complaining changed nothing but unable to stop themselves from doing it anyway. Brennan stood in line, his bowl clutched in hands that trembled slightly. The cough that had been his constant companion for weeks was evolving into something worse. He could feel it in his lungs, a wetness that shouldn't be there, a weight that made each breath a conscious effort. He knew what it meant. Pneumonia. In a camp with no antibiotics and minimal medical care, pneumonia was often a death sentence wrapped in weeks of suffering. Geist was one of the guards supervising the distribution. He stood near the soup kettles, watching the prisoners file past with his usual blank expression. Nothing about his posture or demeanor suggested that he remembered Brennan or the brief moment they had shared during roll call 4 days earlier. He was simply a guard performing his duty, mechanical and distant and separate from the suffering he was witnessing. Brennan reached the front of the line. The prisoner serving soup barely looked at him as he ladled the watery liquid into Brennan's bowl. 3 ladles, which was the standard portion. Not enough to sustain a man, but enough to delay starvation by another day. Brennan took his bowl and turned to leave. Wait. The voice was quiet, barely audible over the general murmur of the soup line. Brennan almost didn't register that someone had spoken to him. But then he felt a hand on his arm, gentle but firm, and he stopped. He turned to find Geist standing beside him, his gray eyes focused on Brennan's face with the same intensity that had characterized their earlier encounter. The guard reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something small. He pressed it into Brennan's hand with a movement so quick and subtle that anyone watching from a distance would have missed it. Then he stepped back, his expression returning to its usual neutrality, and gestured for the next prisoner to move forward. Brennan walked away from the soup line with his bowl in one hand and whatever the guard had given him clutched in the other. He didn't look at it until he was back at his barracks, sitting on his bunk with his back to the door. Only then did he open his palm and examine what he'd been given. It was a piece of chocolate. Small, wrapped in paper that had been folded many times. The paper was thin enough to see the brown square inside, no larger than Brennan's thumb. In the world beyond the camp, it would have been nothing. A treat. A small indulgence. In Stalag VII-A, it was a fortune. Brennan's hands shook as he unwrapped the chocolate. He didn't eat it immediately. Instead, he held it, staring at this impossible gift with something approaching disbelief. Chocolate was supposed to come from Red Cross parcels, which arrived irregularly and were often pilfered by guards before prisoners received them. This chocolate hadn't come from a parcel. It had come from a guard's personal supply, given deliberately, secretly, to a prisoner who was nothing to him. Or was he nothing? The question lodged in Brennan's mind like a splinter. Why had the guard given him chocolate? What had prompted this act of, what? Kindness? Compassion? Something else entirely? The smile during roll call could be explained away as a momentary lapse, a brief glitch in the guard's usual careful neutrality. But this was different. This was deliberate. This required thought and planning and risk. Guards who gave supplies to prisoners faced punishment if caught. Not severe punishment, perhaps, given how thoroughly the German military structure was breaking down. But consequences nonetheless. And for what? To give a dying American a piece of chocolate that wouldn't cure his pneumonia or save his life or change anything fundamental about his situation. Brennan ate the chocolate slowly, letting it melt on his tongue. The taste was so far removed from anything he had experienced in months that it felt like a memory of taste rather than taste itself. Sweet, rich, complex. For just a moment, it transported him away from the barracks, away from the camp, away from the war. He was somewhere else, someone else, a person who had the luxury of eating chocolate without it being a miracle. That evening, during the guards' evening rounds, Brennan made a decision. As der Geist walked past his barracks, Brennan stepped outside into the cold and nodded to him. Just a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement one person gives another when words aren't possible or necessary. The guard's pace didn't change. His expression remained neutral. But as he passed, he nodded back. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have named or explained. Not friendship, which was impossible between guard and prisoner. Not alliance, which would have been dangerous for both of them. Something else. A mutual recognition that beneath the uniforms and the barbed wire and the vast machinery of war, they were both human beings trapped in circumstances neither had chosen and both were trying to survive. Over the following days, small exchanges began to occur. A nod here. A brief moment of eye contact there. Once, when Brennan stumbled during morning roll call, weakened by his worsening condition, der Geist was the guard who helped him stand. The assistance was provided with the same mechanical efficiency that characterized all his actions, but it was provided. Another guard might have ignored him or ordered him to stand on his own. Der Geist helped. The other prisoners noticed. Some of them asked Brennan about it, their questions wrapped in the careful neutrality that prisoners use when they sense something unusual but don't want to draw attention to it. Brennan had no answers to give them. He couldn't explain what was happening because he didn't understand it himself. All he knew was that a guard who had been a ghost was slowly becoming visible, and in becoming visible, was becoming human. And humanity, even in its smallest expressions, was what kept men alive when everything else conspired to kill them. February arrived with a late winter storm that dumped snow across Bavaria and turned Stalag VII-A into a landscape of white silence. The storm isolated the camp further from an outside world that had already forgotten it. Supply deliveries stopped. The camp's already minimal food rations were cut again. Men who had been surviving on the edge of starvation began to cross over into something worse. Brennan's condition deteriorated. The pneumonia that had been building in his lungs finally consumed him entirely. He developed a fever that left him shivering even when piled under every blanket his barracks could spare. His cough became constant, violent, productive of fluids he didn't want to examine too closely. The camp's medical officer, a captured British surgeon who had long since run out of supplies and hope, examined him and said what everyone already knew. Without antibiotics, recovery was unlikely. The sick barracks were filling. Men were transferred there when their conditions became too severe to hide during roll call. It was supposed to be a place of care, but everyone knew it was really a place where the dying were separated from the living so the living didn't have to watch the process too closely. The death rate in those barracks was somewhere between 60 and 70%. Men who went there rarely came back. On February 8, a guard Brennan didn't recognize appeared during morning roll call and told him to pack his few possessions. He was being transferred to the medical barracks. The announcement was delivered without emotion or explanation. It was simply a fact, stated and then withdrawn as the guard moved on to deliver other unpleasant news to other prisoners. Brennan accepted the order without argument. He had known it was coming. The camp system was designed to process people efficiently, and he had become too sick to fit into the general population's routine. His transfer was logical, inevitable, and probably final. He said quiet goodbyes to the men in his barracks who had shared space with him for months. They responded with the careful distance of people who knew they were saying goodbye to someone they would likely never see again. He gathered his possessions. A spare shirt. A small notebook where he had recorded dates and thoughts in handwriting that had gradually deteriorated as his strength faded. A photograph of his family that had somehow survived capture and months of captivity. These items fit into a cloth bag that had once held Red Cross supplies. He slung it over his shoulder and walked toward the sick barracks with the same mechanical acceptance that had characterized so much of his imprisonment. The guard who had delivered the transfer order walked ahead of him, his rifle slung over his shoulder with the casual indifference of someone who knew the prisoners were too weak to pose a threat. They crossed the camp slowly, passing through the American section, then through a section of French prisoners, then into an area Brennan rarely saw. The sick barracks sat at the far edge of the camp, isolated from the main population in a way that felt deliberate. Out of sight, out of mind. They were halfway there when a second guard intercepted them. Der Geist appeared from between two buildings, his gray uniform almost invisible against the gray sky and white snow. He spoke to the first guard in rapid German that Brennan couldn't follow. The first guard responded, also in German, his tone carrying an edge of irritation. An argument developed. Not heated, but persistent. The two guards spoke back and forth while Brennan stood between them, swaying slightly, his fever making it difficult to focus on what was happening. The first guard finally shrugged and walked away, leaving Brennan alone with Der Geist. The ghost guard studied Brennan's face with that same intense attention that had characterized their earlier encounters. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled again. That same small, private smile. And he gestured for Brennan to follow him in a different direction. They didn't go to the sick barracks. Instead, Der Geist led Brennan to a small building near the camp's administrative section. It looked like a storage shed, unremarkable and easy to overlook. The guard unlocked the door and motioned for Brennan to enter. Brennan hesitated. Every instinct developed over months of captivity told him that following a guard to an isolated building was dangerous. But his fever was high enough that danger felt abstract, and exhaustion had stripped away his ability to resist. Inside, the building was warmer than anywhere Brennan had been in weeks. A small wood stove burned in the corner, radiating heat that felt like a physical embrace. There was a cot along one wall, covered with actual blankets rather than the thin rags the prisoners used. And on a small table sat items that Brennan's mind could barely process. Food. Real food. Bread, cheese, some kind of preserved meat. And next to the food, a bottle containing liquid that looked medicinal. Der Geist closed the door behind them and locked it. He pointed to the cot, indicating that Brennan should sit. Brennan complied, his legs giving out as much as sitting down. The guard picked up the bottle from the table and held it out. He spoke a single word in German that Brennan didn't understand, then tried again in broken English. Medicine. 4. He pointed at Brennan's chest. Antibiotics. Somehow, in a camp where medical supplies had vanished months ago, this guard had obtained antibiotics. Brennan took the bottle with shaking hands and stared at it as if it might vanish if he blinked. Der Geist demonstrated the dosage, using gestures to explain how much to take and how often. Then he pointed at the food and made it clear that Brennan should eat. For the next hour, Brennan sat in that warm shed while Der Geist stood guard outside. He ate bread that didn't taste like sawdust. He drank water that didn't carry the metallic tang of the camp's contaminated supply. He took the first dose of medicine that might actually save his life. And through the small window in the shed, he watched snow continue to fall, covering everything in a white silence that felt almost peaceful. When Der Geist returned, he brought additional items. More blankets. A second bottle of medicine. Some kind of ointment for Brennan's cracked, frost-damaged hands. He arranged these items carefully on the table, then stood back and looked at Brennan with an expression that was no longer neutral. It was concerned. Tired. Human. He spoke in German, a longer statement that Brennan couldn't understand. But tone carries meaning that transcends language. The guard was explaining something, perhaps justifying his actions, perhaps simply acknowledging what they both knew. That this was dangerous. That he was violating rules and putting himself at risk. That he was choosing to do it anyway. Brennan found his voice, hoarse and weak but still functional. Why? It was the only question that mattered. Why would a German guard risk punishment to save the life of an American prisoner? Why would an enemy become a protector? Why would someone choose compassion in a system designed to eliminate it? Der Geist considered the question. His response came slowly, in German, then in broken English as he searched for words that would convey his meaning. I have, son. Same, age. He pointed at Brennan. He is, soldier. Maybe, prisoner. Maybe. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Understanding settled over Brennan like the warmth from the stove. Der Geist wasn't saving him because of who Brennan was. He was saving him because of who Brennan represented. A son in uniform. A young man caught in a war he didn't start. Someone's child who deserved to survive long enough to go home. The guard's son was probably fighting on the Eastern Front or defending some crumbling position in the West. Probably hungry and cold and terrified just like Brennan had been before his capture. And der Geist, who had no power to save his own son, was trying to save someone else's. It was an impossible gesture of hope in a situation where hope had no rational basis. But rationality, Brennan was learning, had nothing to do with it. They sat in silence for a while, guard and prisoner, enemy and savior, two men who shared no common language but understood each other completely. Then der Geist stood and indicated it was time for Brennan to leave. He couldn't stay in the shed indefinitely. People would notice his absence. Questions would be asked. Before Brennan left, the guard pressed something else into his hand. A small photograph, worn and creased from being carried in a wallet or pocket. It showed a young man in a Wehrmacht uniform, smiling at the camera with the optimism of someone who didn't yet know what war would do to him. Der Geist pointed at the photograph, then at himself. My son. Brennan looked at the face in the photograph. He was about Brennan's age, maybe younger. He had his father's eyes. Those same gray eyes that had first noticed Brennan during morning roll call, that had seen not a prisoner but a person, that had chosen to smile when smiling made no logical sense. I'll remember him, Brennan said, even though he knew the guard probably couldn't understand all the words. But again, some meanings transcend language. Der Geist nodded. He took the photograph back, returned it carefully to his pocket, and opened the door. They stepped out into the snow. The transfer to the sick barracks had been forgotten, or perhaps deliberately obscured in the camp's deteriorating record-keeping. Brennan was returned to his regular barracks with instructions to continue his normal routine. No one questioned it. In a camp where systems were breaking down and rules were increasingly arbitrary, one prisoner's inexplicable return to his barracks was just another minor irregularity in a long list of things that didn't quite make sense anymore. But Brennan had the medicine. He had the extra food carefully hidden in his cloth bag. He had warmth that would fade but would sustain him through the worst of his illness. And he had something even more valuable. He had proof that humanity could persist even here, even now, even when every rational calculation suggested it should have been extinguished long ago. That night, as he took his second dose of antibiotics and felt them beginning their slow work of fighting the infection in his lungs, Brennan understood something he hadn't understood before. Survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about carrying forward the evidence that kindness had existed. That in the worst place, at the worst time, someone had chosen to be more than what their uniform demanded. And that choice, small as it was, meant everything. The medicine worked. Slowly, incrementally, with setbacks and improvements that alternated like weather, Brennan's lungs began to clear. The cough persisted but lost its violent edge. The fever broke and stayed broken. The weight in his chest that had made each breath an effort gradually lifted until breathing became, once again, something his body did automatically rather than something he had to consciously accomplish. The improvement didn't go unnoticed. Other prisoners asked questions that Brennan couldn't answer truthfully. How had he recovered when so many others hadn't? What was his secret? Had he received medication from the Red Cross? Brennan deflected with vague responses about luck and constitution, knowing that the real answer would put both himself and der Geist at risk if it became widely known. But some truths leaked through silence. The camp was too small, too interconnected, for complete secrecy. Prisoners who had watched Brennan's near transfer to the sick barracks and his subsequent recovery began to piece together a narrative. That guard. The one they called der Geist. He had something to do with it. Somehow, he was helping Brennan. The story spread in whispers, mutating as it passed from person to person until it bore only a passing resemblance to reality. Der Geist must have known. Guards always knew when stories circulated about them. But his behavior didn't change. He continued his patrols with the same mechanical precision, maintained the same careful distance, showed the same blank neutrality that had earned him his ghostly nickname. If he felt any danger from the rumors, he gave no indication. Perhaps he didn't care. Perhaps he had already accepted whatever consequences might come from his choice to help. February stretched into March. The war's end felt closer but still remained frustratingly out of reach. News filtered into the camp through clandestine radios and new prisoners who arrived with tales of Germany's collapsing fronts. The Americans were across the Rhine. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Berlin was being bombed day and night. The end was inevitable, but inevitability still required time to unfold. Brennan's recovery was complete enough by mid-March that he could participate fully in the camp's routines again. Morning roll call without collapsing. Work details that accomplished nothing but satisfied the guards' need to maintain the illusion of order. The endless waiting that defined POW existence, punctuated by moments of fear when aircraft flew overhead or distant artillery rumbled like thunder that never broke. He saw der Geist regularly but never alone. Their interactions were limited to the brief moments during roll call or patrol when their paths crossed. A nod here. A glance there. Small acknowledgments of what had passed between them but nothing that would draw attention. Both men understood the necessity of distance. What the guard had done was complete. Brennan had survived. Any further connection would only increase the danger for both of them. But the photograph stayed in Brennan's mind. That young soldier in the Wehrmacht uniform, smiling at a camera before the war had ground away his optimism. Der Geist's son. Someone's son. Every prisoner in Stalag VII-A was someone's son, and every guard too. The war had turned them into enemies, but it couldn't erase the fundamental truth that they were all human beings who had existed before the war and hoped to exist after it. Late March brought new arrivals. More prisoners, captured during the final, desperate German offensives that everyone knew were futile. These new men carried stories of chaos on the fronts, of units that had ceased to exist as organized fighting forces, of soldiers who surrendered not because they wanted to but because continuing to fight served no purpose beyond adding to the casualty lists. One of these new arrivals was brought to Brennan's barracks. He was young, maybe 19, an infantry private from Iowa who looked like he should still be in high school. He had been captured 3 days earlier and was still processing the shock of it. The other prisoners, veterans of months or years of captivity, recognized that particular brand of fresh trauma and gave him space to adjust. The young soldier's name was Thomas. He sat on the bunk that had been assigned to him and stared at nothing, his hands shaking slightly even though the barracks was as warm as it ever got. Brennan sat down beside him after evening roll call and offered what comfort he could. It gets easier. You learn the routines. You survive. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but Thomas seemed to need to hear them anyway. I keep thinking about my mom, Thomas said quietly. She doesn't know I've been captured. She probably thinks I'm dead. And my dad. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Brennan thought about der Geist. About a father who wore a uniform and guarded prisoners and somewhere in the middle of all that tried to maintain his humanity by saving one life because he couldn't save the one life that mattered most to him. Someone out there is worried about you, Brennan said. Parents, friends, someone. And when this is over, you'll get back to them. That's what we're here for. To wait until we can go home. Thomas nodded, but his expression suggested he didn't quite believe it. Brennan understood. He hadn't believed it either during his first weeks of captivity. Belief required hope, and hope was a luxury that took time to rebuild after capture stripped it away. But Thomas would learn, the same way Brennan had learned, that survival was its own form of hope. Every day you woke up was evidence that the war hadn't won yet. April arrived. The guards grew noticeably more nervous. Their routines, which had been so predictable for so long, began to fray. Morning roll calls became shorter, less thorough. Food distribution became more chaotic. The camp's administrative structure, already minimal, started to dissolve entirely. Officers who had maintained the pretense of order stopped pretending. Guards who had enforced rules stopped caring whether rules were followed. Der Geist was one of the few guards whose behavior remained consistent. He still walked his patrols. Still counted prisoners during roll call. Still distributed food with the same careful precision. But even he showed signs of strain. His face, which had been carefully neutral for so long, began to show cracks. Fatigue. Worry. The weight of knowing what everyone knew but couldn't speak aloud. The war was ending, and when it ended, the guards would become prisoners themselves. On April 15, Brennan saw der Geist stumble during his morning patrol. It was a small thing, barely noticeable. The guard caught himself quickly and continued walking as if nothing had happened. But Brennan had been watching him long enough to recognize that something was wrong. The guard's movements were less fluid, his steps less certain. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. After roll call, Brennan took a risk. He approached the fence where der Geist sometimes stood during his afternoon break. The guard was alone, staring out at the landscape beyond the camp with an expression that Brennan had never seen on his face before. Not neutral. Not careful. Just tired. Profoundly, deeply tired. "Your son," Brennan said quietly, in English, knowing the guard might not understand all the words but hoping the tone would convey his meaning. "He's lucky to have you as a father." Der Geist turned to look at him. For a long moment, they stood on opposite sides of the fence, guard and prisoner, enemy and, what? Friend was too strong a word. Savior and saved was too simple. They were two men who had briefly glimpsed each other's humanity in a place designed to obscure it, and that glimpse had created a connection that neither could have predicted or explained. The guard reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, his thumb tracing the edge of the worn paper. Then he looked back at Brennan. When he spoke, his English was halting but clear enough. "He is missing. I do not know." The words hung in the air between them. Missing. That terrible word that meant nothing and everything. Not dead, but not alive either. Existing in the liminal space between hope and grief where families lived when soldiers disappeared into war and never emerged. Der Geist had been carrying that weight while performing his duties, while helping Brennan, while maintaining the careful neutrality that his position required. "I'm sorry," Brennan said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. He was sorry for the war that had taken both of their lives and twisted them into enemies. Sorry for the system that had put a father in the position of guarding other fathers' sons while his own son was lost somewhere in the chaos. Sorry for everything that had led them both to this place, this moment, this impossible conversation across a fence that shouldn't have existed. Der Geist nodded. He returned the photograph to his pocket and straightened his uniform with the automatic gesture of a soldier who had performed that action thousands of times. The brief crack in his armor closed. His expression returned to its careful neutrality. The ghost reasserted itself, hiding the human underneath. But Brennan had seen behind the mask. They both had. And seeing changed everything, even when it changed nothing at all. April 29, 1945. The liberation of Stalag VII-A began not with triumph but with confusion. American tanks appeared on the horizon in the early morning, their engines rumbling across the landscape like approaching thunder. The guards who had maintained the camp for years did not resist. They stood in small groups, their rifles stacked against buildings, their hands raised, their expressions reflecting a complex mixture of relief and resignation. The prisoners emerged from their barracks slowly, uncertain whether what they were seeing was real. Freedom, after months or years of captivity, didn't feel like the explosive joy they had imagined. It felt muted, tentative, almost anticlimactic. They stood in the compound and watched American soldiers enter the camp, and the moment that should have been transcendent was instead quiet, marked more by exhaustion than celebration. Brennan stood with the other men from his barracks and looked for der Geist. The guard was not among those who had gathered in the main compound. Brennan scanned the camp, searching for that gray uniform, those gray eyes, that face he had come to know without ever really knowing anything about the man beneath it. But der Geist had vanished, becoming truly ghostlike in those first chaotic hours of liberation. The American soldiers moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, processing prisoners and guards, distributing food and medical supplies, establishing order in a place that had lost any meaningful organization weeks ago. Officers interviewed prisoners about conditions in the camp, documented evidence of mistreatment, compiled lists of names and nationalities and details that would later be used in trials and reports. Brennan gave his statement to a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 23. He described his capture, his time in the camp, his illness and recovery. He did not mention der Geist. When the lieutenant asked specifically about guard behavior, Brennan gave vague responses about routine enforcement of rules and minimal violence compared to other camps. The lieutenant seemed satisfied and moved on to the next prisoner. That night, freed prisoners slept in their barracks one last time before being transported to processing centers. The Americans had established a field hospital to treat the most seriously ill and injured. Food trucks arrived with supplies that seemed impossibly abundant after months of starvation rations. Men who had been enemies hours ago now coexisted in an awkward liminal space where old categories no longer applied but new ones hadn't yet been established. Brennan couldn't sleep. He walked through the camp in the darkness, his feet carrying him along paths he had walked hundreds of times as a prisoner. The fence was still standing, though it no longer served any purpose. The guard towers were empty. The barracks that had held so much suffering were quiet now, occupied by men who were no longer prisoners but not yet fully free. He found Geist near the camp's southern perimeter, sitting on the ground with his back against a building. The guard was out of uniform now, wearing civilian clothes that looked too large for his frame. He was alone, separate from the other guards who had been gathered together for processing. When he saw Brennan approaching, he didn't stand or flee or react with surprise. He simply watched and waited. Brennan sat down beside him. They sat in silence for a long time, two men who had no common language but no longer needed one. The war was over, at least for them. They had survived, though survival meant different things for each of them. Brennan would go home to his family in Philadelphia. Geist would become a prisoner himself, processed through the same systems that had once employed him, waiting to learn what his future held. Finally, Geist spoke. His English was still broken, still difficult, but he managed to convey his meaning. You, alive. Good. You go, home. Yes, Brennan said. And you? The guard shrugged. I do not, know. He paused, searching for words. My son. I still do not know. Brennan reached into his pocket and withdrew something he had been carrying since his recovery. A small piece of paper on which he had written his parents' address in Philadelphia. He handed it to Geist. After the war. If you find out about your son, or if you need help, write to this address. I'll help if I can. Geist looked at the paper for a long time. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. He nodded, but didn't speak. What could he say? Thank you felt inadequate for the impossible gift of mutual recognition in a place that had tried so hard to eliminate recognition entirely. Sorry seemed equally insufficient. They had both done what they could with the choices available to them. They sat together until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. When the camp started to wake, Geist stood and walked away without looking back. Brennan watched him go, this guard who had saved his life for reasons that had less to do with Brennan himself and more to do with a father's desperate hope that somewhere, someone might show the same mercy to his missing son. 3 days later, Brennan was transported to a processing center in France. From there, he was sent to England, then finally home to Philadelphia. The journey took weeks, moving him through systems designed to transform prisoners back into soldiers, soldiers back into civilians, survivors back into ordinary people who would somehow have to live ordinary lives after extraordinary trauma. His parents met him at the train station. His mother cried. His father gripped his hand with a strength that suggested he would never let go. They brought him home to a house that looked exactly the same but felt completely different because he was different, changed in ways he couldn't explain to people who loved him but could never fully understand where he had been or what he had seen. He tried to return to normal life. He got a job. He dated a girl he had known before the war. He attended church on Sundays and helped his father with projects around the house and did all the things that people expected him to do. But at night, when he was alone, he thought about Stalag VII-A. About the cold. About the hunger. About the guard who had smiled at him and then saved his life for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a son who might never come home. In 1946, a letter arrived at his parents' house. The envelope was thin, the paper poor quality, the postage unfamiliar. Inside was a single page written in careful German with a rough English translation attempted in the margins. It was from Geist, though he signed his real name now. Hans Müller. The letter was brief. Hans had survived processing as a prisoner of war and been released after several months. He had returned to his home in Bavaria to find his house damaged but standing, his wife alive but aged beyond her years by worry. And his son. His son had been found in a Soviet prisoner of war camp, alive, malnourished but surviving. They had been reunited in October 1945. Because of your prayers, the letter said, though Brennan had never told Hans he prayed for him or his son. Perhaps Hans simply believed that prayers had been said, and perhaps he was right. Brennan had thought about them often enough that thought became a kind of prayer, a hope sent into the universe with no expectation of answer but offered anyway because that was what humans did when they cared about people they would never see again. The letter ended with a line that Brennan read over and over until he had memorized it. "Thank you for your kindness in those dark days. I hope I can one day do something worth what you suffered." Brennan wanted to write back and explain that Hans had it backwards. That Brennan hadn't suffered anything Hans needed to repay. That the debt, if there was one, ran in the opposite direction. That a smile during morning roll call and a piece of chocolate and medicine in a warm shed had saved not just Brennan's life but something more important. His belief that humanity could persist even in humanity's darkest moments. But Brennan never sent that letter. He kept the address. He sometimes drafted responses in his mind. But the words never seemed adequate to the task. How do you thank someone for teaching you that kindness isn't contingent on circumstances, that compassion doesn't require permission, that even in places designed to eliminate humanity, humanity finds ways to survive? So he did the only thing he could. He lived. He married the girl he had been dating and they had 3 children. He told them stories about the war, edited versions that emphasized camaraderie and endurance rather than suffering and fear. He worked hard at jobs that had nothing to do with the war. He grew old in a world that gradually forgot the details of what he had experienced and remembered only the broad strokes. But he never forgot Hans Müller. He never forgot the smile. He never forgot the choice a father made to save someone else's son when he couldn't save his own. And whenever anyone asked him about his time in Stalag VII-A, which happened less and less as years passed, he always said the same thing. "A guard saved my life. I don't know why. But I'm grateful he did." Years passed. Then decades. The war became history, and history became memory, and memory became stories that people told when they wanted to remind themselves that even the worst times contained moments of grace. Brennan lived the kind of full life that men who survived terrible things often build as evidence that their survival was worth the cost. He attended reunions with other veterans and found that he had little to say to men who had experienced similar things. The shared trauma created a bond, but it was a bond of silence rather than speech. They understood each other's choice to speak little of what they had endured. They recognized in each other the same careful distance from the past that allowed them to function in the present. In 1985, 40 years after liberation, a researcher from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum contacted Brennan. They were collecting oral histories from survivors of German prisoner of war camps as part of a broader effort to document the war's human experiences. Would he be willing to be interviewed? Brennan agreed, though he warned them his story was unremarkable. He had been a prisoner. He had survived. Thousands of men had similar experiences. But the researcher insisted that every story mattered, that each perspective added detail to the larger picture, that history was built from individual moments as much as from grand strategies. The interview took place in Brennan's home, in the living room where he had raised his children and watched television and lived the ordinary life that had once seemed impossible during those cold mornings at Stalag VII-A. The researcher, a young woman named Sarah who had been born long after the war ended, set up recording equipment and asked careful questions designed to help him remember without forcing him to relive. He told her about his capture. About the conditions in the camp. About the hunger and cold and the slow erosion of hope that characterized long-term captivity. She listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, always respectful of his pauses when memories became difficult to access. Then she asked about the guards. Were there any who treated prisoners with unusual kindness or cruelty? Did he have any interactions that stood out in memory? And Brennan, who had never told anyone the full story, not his wife, not his children, not his fellow veterans, found himself talking about Hans Müller. About the smile during morning roll call that had meant nothing and everything. About the piece of chocolate and the antibiotics that saved his life. About the photograph of a missing son and a father's desperate attempt to create meaning in a meaningless situation by showing mercy to someone else's child. Sarah listened with an intensity that reminded Brennan of why he had agreed to the interview. She wasn't just recording facts. She was bearing witness. And witnessing, he realized, was sacred work. It transformed private experiences into shared history. It said, this happened. These people existed. Their choices mattered. Do you know what happened to Hans Müller? Sarah asked. Did you ever see him again? No, Brennan said. We exchanged one letter in 1946. He told me his son had been found alive. After that. He shrugged. Life moved on. We were in different countries, different worlds. The war ended and we went back to being who we had been before, except we weren't who we had been before. We were changed. Sarah made notes, her pen moving across her pad with quick efficiency. The fact that he helped you, knowing he could face punishment, that suggests remarkable courage. Or maybe remarkable humanity. Both, Brennan said. It was both. But mostly it was desperation. He couldn't help his own son, so he helped me. I understood that. I understood that I wasn't special or chosen. I was just there. I was the one he could reach. But he chose to reach, Sarah said. That's what matters. He could have done nothing. Most of the guards did nothing. He chose differently. Brennan nodded. He had thought about this over the years, this question of choice and circumstance. Was Hans Müller a good man who remained good despite his role as a guard? Or was he an ordinary man who made one good choice in a sea of necessary compromises? Did the distinction matter? I think, Brennan said slowly, that the war showed us what people were capable of, both terrible and beautiful. Most people weren't saints or monsters. They were just people trying to survive impossible situations. And sometimes, in the middle of all that survival, they made choices that had nothing to do with survival. They chose to be kind when kindness served no purpose. They chose to recognize another person's humanity when they could have chosen to see only an enemy or a number or a problem to be managed. And those choices saved lives, Sarah said. Yes. But more than that. Brennan paused, searching for words to describe something he had never quite articulated before. They saved the idea that humans could be more than what the war demanded. Every small act of kindness was evidence against the war's claim that we were only what it made us. Hans Müller's smile, his gift of chocolate, his decision to help me, those things proved that the war hadn't won completely. That there were still spaces, however small, where humanity persisted. The interview continued for another hour. Sarah asked about his post-war life, his family, his work, all the details that transformed a story about war into a story about life. When she finally turned off the recording equipment, she thanked him for his time and his honesty. These stories matter, she said as she was leaving. They need to be preserved. People need to understand that the war wasn't just battles and strategies. It was millions of individual moments. Small choices that had enormous consequences. A smile that saved a life. Those are the stories that make history human. After she left, Brennan sat in his living room and thought about Hans Müller for the first time in years. Was he still alive? Brennan would be 73 now, which meant Hans would be in his 80s if he had survived. Maybe he was sitting in a living room in Bavaria, an old man remembering the same days from the opposite perspective. A guard who had broken rules to help a prisoner because he couldn't bear not to. Brennan hoped he was alive. He hoped Hans had lived long enough to see his son grow old, to have grandchildren, to build a life in peace after a war that had stolen so much from so many. He hoped that when Hans looked back on his time as a guard, he remembered not the days he had followed orders but the day he had chosen compassion over compliance. But more than that, Brennan hoped that Hans understood what his choice had meant. Not just that it had saved Brennan's life, though it had. But that it had saved something larger. It had preserved evidence that even in the worst circumstances, humans could transcend their roles and recognize each other's fundamental worth. That recognition, that smile, that small gift of chocolate in the darkest winter, those things proved that the war couldn't completely erase what made them human. And if that wasn't worth remembering, Brennan didn't know what was. Michael Brennan died in 1998, aged 81. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was brief, noting his service in World War II, his career as an accountant, his surviving wife and 3 children and 7 grandchildren. It mentioned that he had been a prisoner of war but didn't elaborate. Most obituaries don't. They summarize lives in paragraphs, reduce decades to sentences, transform complex experiences into simple facts. His family held a small funeral. The priest who conducted the service had never met him and spoke in generalities about faithful service and loving family and peaceful rest. Veterans from his old unit, those still alive and able to travel, attended and stood together in their aging bodies, remembering not just Brennan but all the men they had known who weren't there. At the reception after the funeral, Brennan's daughter found a letter in his desk drawer. It was the letter from Hans Müller, carefully preserved in an envelope marked "Important." She read it, though her German was poor and Mueller's English translation in the margins was rough. She understood enough. A guard who had helped her father. A son who had been missing and then found. A thank you that spanned decades and continents. She asked her mother about it. Her mother, who had been married to Brennan for 50 years, knew only fragments of the story. She knew he had been saved by a guard during his imprisonment. She knew it had mattered to him in ways he couldn't quite explain. But he had never told her the full story, never shared the details of that cold January when a smile and a piece of chocolate had meant the difference between life and death. The daughter, whose name was Ellen, decided she wanted to know more. She contacted the Holocaust Memorial Museum and found the interview Sarah had conducted 13 years earlier. She listened to her father's voice, recorded when he was still strong and clear, telling a story she had never heard. And she understood, perhaps for the first time, who he had been before he became her father. Ellen traveled to Germany in 1999. It was not difficult to find Hans Mueller's family. Small towns keep records. People remember. The Mueller family still lived in the same area of Bavaria where Hans had returned after the war. His son, now in his 70s himself, was surprised to receive a letter from an American woman asking about his father. Hans Mueller had died in 1989, a decade before Brennan. His son, Franz, agreed to meet with Ellen in the village where he lived. They sat in a small cafe and spoke in English, which Franz had learned well during the post-war years when American soldiers had occupied the region and English had become a valuable skill. Franz told Ellen what his father had told him late in his life. About his time as a guard at Stalag VII-A. About his fear for Franz, who had been missing on the Eastern Front. About his decision to help a sick American prisoner because he couldn't help his own son. About the smile that had started it all, that moment of recognition when he had looked at a prisoner and seen not an enemy but someone's son who deserved to survive. He never spoke of it for many years, Franz said. It was only when I pressed him, when I was old enough to understand, that he told me. He said he had done so little that it embarrassed him to speak of it. A smile. Some medicine. Such small things. But when he received your father's address, when he learned that the American had survived the war and gone home, he said it was one of the only good things he had done during those years. That in a time of darkness, he had created one small light. Ellen showed Franz the letter his father had written in 1946. Franz had never seen it. He read it slowly, his finger following the lines of his father's handwriting. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. You must understand, Franz said. My father carried guilt for the rest of his life. Not for what he did personally, but for what he was part of. For wearing the uniform. For serving a system that caused such suffering. He tried to make peace with it by being a good husband, a good father, a good neighbor. But the war never left him. None of us who lived through it could escape it completely. They talked for hours. Ellen learned about Franz's experience as a prisoner in Soviet camps, about his long journey home, about rebuilding a life in a Germany that had been shattered and then rebuilt in a different image. Franz learned about her father's life in America, about his family and career and the ordinary happiness he had managed to construct after extraordinary suffering. Before they parted, Franz gave Ellen a photograph. It was the same photograph Hans had shown Brennan in January 1945. The young soldier in Wehrmacht uniform, smiling at the camera. On the back, in faded ink, Hans had written a date and a note in German. Franz translated, "My son Franz, before his deployment. May God protect him." Your father saw this photograph, Franz said. My father showed it to him in the camp. It connected them. My father saw your father as me, and your father saw me as himself. That recognition, it saved both their lives in different ways. Your father literally. My father spiritually. Ellen returned to America with the photograph and a deeper understanding of her father's war. She donated his interview recording and the letters to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, adding them to the archive of stories that documented not just the history of what happened but the human meaning of it. The museum created an exhibit several years later about small acts of resistance and humanity during the war. Among the hundreds of stories they collected, they included Brennan and Mueller's. A display case held copies of the letters they had exchanged, the photograph of Franz, and a recording of Brennan's voice telling the story one last time. Thousands of people walked past that exhibit. Most paused briefly, read the labels, looked at the artifacts, and moved on. But some stopped longer. They read the complete story. They understood that war, which history often presents as grand strategies and major battles, was actually composed of millions of individual moments. A smile across a prison compound. A piece of chocolate pressed into a dying man's hand. A father's desperate choice to save someone else's son because he couldn't save his own. Those visitors left the museum changed, even if they couldn't articulate how. They carried with them the knowledge that humanity persists. That even in the darkest times, people make choices that transcend their circumstances. That kindness isn't contingent on favorable conditions or easy options or guaranteed positive outcomes. It exists because people choose to create it, even when creating it is difficult and dangerous and seemingly pointless. Hans Müller and Michael Brennan never saw each other again after April 1945. They exchanged one letter and then their paths diverged permanently. But the connection they formed in Stalag VII-A survived both their deaths. It lived in the stories their families told. In the archive recordings that preserved their voices. In the exhibit that taught new generations about the complicated human reality of war. And most importantly, it lived in the simple, undeniable truth that a smile, given at the right moment, can save a life. Not just the physical life of one sick prisoner, but the spiritual life of one conflicted guard. Not just in that moment, but across decades, rippling forward through time until it reached people who hadn't been born when the war was fought, who would never experience anything comparable to what Brennan and Müller endured, but who needed to know that humans are capable of being more than what their worst circumstances demand. That's the legacy. Not that people survived, though survival matters. Not that good defeated evil, though that matters too. But that in the middle of humanity's darkest chapter, small lights continue to shine. Individual people making individual choices to recognize each other's humanity when they could have chosen indifference or cruelty. A smile across a prison yard. A piece of chocolate. Medicine that saved a life. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't heroic acts that changed the course of the war. They were small, private, almost invisible moments that changed the course of two lives and, through those two lives, touched countless others. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Sometimes, a smile is all that stands between despair and hope. And sometimes, that smile saves not just one life, but the idea that life is worth saving at all. That's what Michael Brennan learned in a prison camp in Bavaria in the winter of 1945. That's what Hans Müller proved by choosing compassion over compliance. And that's what their story continues to teach, long after both men have gone, to anyone willing to listen. In the darkest times, be the light. It might not seem like much. It might not feel like it matters. But to someone cold and sick and dying in a place where hope has been systematically eliminated, your small act of kindness might be everything. It might be the difference between survival and surrender. Between remembering that humans can be good and believing that goodness has been extinguished. A smile. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. When given at the right moment, in the right way, to the right person, it can save a life. And saving one life, as an ancient teaching says, is like saving the entire world. Michael Brennan's world was saved by a smile. He lived another 53 years because Hans Müller chose to see him as a person rather than a prisoner. And in those 53 years, he touched countless other lives, creating ripples that extended far beyond anything either man could have predicted or imagined. That's the power of small acts. That's the weight of individual choices. That's why the story of when a smile saved a life matters, will always matter, should never be forgotten. Because it reminds us that we are never powerless. That even in the most constrained circumstances, we retain the ability to choose kindness. And those choices, however small they seem, create the only kind of immortality that really matters. The kind that lives in memory. In stories. In the hearts of people who hear what you did and decide to do the same for someone else. That's how a smile in 1945 continues to save lives in 2025 and will continue saving them long after everyone who remembers the war is gone. Because humanity isn't defined by our worst moments. It's defined by what we choose to do inside those moments. And sometimes, all we need to do is smile.